Hey class, good morning. This is a video lecture for April 21st. I have entitled this period Moving Forward, Preventing and Combating Post-Conflict Sexualized Violence. So, we just have two short things in there for today. One is a news video interview segment, and one is a news article from Al Jazeera by a woman named Bina Shah, whose article is entitled "Want to End Sexualized Violence Against Women, Fix the Men." And so both of these both of these resources today really are important because oftentimes when we focus on survivors of sexualized violence, that's very important. We do that. We often do that, but in our conversations about combating sexualized violence, whether in peacetime or in war or genocide, we often tend to neglect the root causes of this violence. And some of the root causes of this violence stem from misogyny and patriarchal social structures, right? And we often hear about things such as toxic masculinities, and this is what we need to focus on in order to effectively combat sexualized violence. So, and we talked about, already in classes we have talked about structural violence and particular norms regarding gender. Remember, gender norms vary from place to place, time to time. Society is a society. And so this is an important article, and I wanted to mention it because it focused on a couple things. This was written in 2014. And in the beginning of the article, Shah mentions the Global Summit to End Violence Against Women, which was held in 2014 in England. And this was a groundbreaking convening of practitioners, delegates, people in government from all over the world to try to address the issue of conflict-related sexualized violence, right? So if you click on the link in the article about the summit, you'll go to the main page, which has a whole bunch of information about the aims of the summit, the statement of the chair from the summit, a statement of action that they put together, and other related press releases and other information, which is really super awesome. This was such an important convening of people dedicated to eradicating sexualized violence and conflict, right? So while they were doing such super awesome work regarding survivors in particular, one thing became clear to the author of this article as well as others that there was this need to address the true origins of this violence, right? Um, the particularly the skewed concept of masculinity in patriarchal societies and the need to confront male perpetrators of violence with more than just retributive justice mechanisms, more than just putting them in jail, sentencing them at trial, things like that, which is all very important. Of course, we need to hold perpetrators accountable, but this does not, again, still get to the root causes, right? So she cites an academic by the name of Amoua de Sandi, who analyzed the ways in which a certain type of rigid patriarchal form of masculinity that expresses itself at times in the form of sexualized violence, right? So as women have become increasingly exerting their rights and gaining voices throughout the world in different contexts, and in our context too, we can kind of see shadows of this. There has been a backlash because of this, right? The more women exert their rights, gain voices, become equal participants in society, there's oftentimes a backlash against this by men and people in power, right? Shah gives an example of one woman in Pakistan. She is Pakistani herself, but she gives an example of one woman in Pakistan who was brutally murdered because she challenged those regressive gender prescriptions, as you can see in the article, right? So at the London Festival in 2014, Shah discussed some fringe events that focused on the role of men in ending sexualized violence, hosted by CARE International. Now, at this convening, they had a whole bunch of conferences, events, and things like that, and they had some fringe events that weren't like every other people would go to if they were interested in, that were held kind of concurrently at the same time as other events and stuff like that. But there were two fringe events that she visited, or that she became acquainted with, and these were hosted by CARE International. And if you click on the link The first one, it talks about the Young Men Initiative in Bosnia, right? So you can click on that link and get more information, particularly with regard to this initiative. And this was an initiative in Bosnia that used things such as drama, sports, workshops to teach men and boys how not to use violence, particularly against women, to prove their masculinity. We've talked about the idea of um, uh, rape is a performative act of masculinity, right? In this class. So for some men who feel threatened in their masculinity, sometimes we resort to violence to kind of prove how masculine we are, right? And so it's tied into these ideas of masculinity as excessive displays of toughness, power, virility, things like that, right? So the Young Men Initiative in Bosnia is trying to combat these sort of ideas, right? The other link is called that's my cat. The called the Rwandan Men's Resource Center, and if you click on the link, then click on the section that says About Us, you get a good idea about the reason for this program and center. It's a men's organization that strives to reach out to other men in order to promote gender equality through the promotion of positive masculinities, reforming negative male practices, including sexualized violence against women, and engagement of men as positive supporters of women and each other, right? In order to foster a more positive masculine identity, right? So the quote that sums up the importance of Shah's articles and programs such as these is, I think, this quote in particular. And today's global focus on empowering women will fail utterly and completely unless it also encompasses educating and reforming the men that live beside them, right? So keep that in mind as you're thinking about the next video from Al Jazeera. This was a news segment wherein people in Sierra Leone were interviewed. The title of the video is "Why Has Sierra Leone Declared Rape a National Emergency?" The president of Sierra Leone in February 2019 announced emergency measures to fight sexualized violence, which has become kind of pandemic in the country, right? There's also an article and other information in our additional materials folder about this national emergency declaration, etc. So, a couple of things that they did was they instituted free healthcare for survivors of sexualized violence, stepping up prosecution of perpetrators. Now, there's a representative in this news segment, Agatha. She's a representative from the Rainbow Institute. We briefly mentioned this in Leatherman Chapter 6 when we talked about last week on April 14th, our stuff for April 14th. We talked about the human rights instruments and the protection agenda. There is a link in our April 14th folder about the Rainbow Initiative and some of the work that they do, which has been really a great, particularly wonderful grassroots work they have been doing for survivors of sexualized violence and also other programs to educate men, right? So right now there is no conflict in Sierra Leone. The civil war that Sierra Leone had ended in 2002. However, during the civil war, there were very high levels of sexualized violence committed by rebel groups, in particular the RUF. However, right now in Sierra Leone, there are extremely high incidents of sexualized violence committed by civilians. So this is all committed by civilians right now, and it should be considered a legacy of the Civil War and a high incidence of sexualized violence during the Civil War. So that's important to understand. It might not even be conflict related, but it is a legacy of the conflict, right? Wherein there was so much sexualized violence being committed by perpetrators, right? And now it is civilians doing this. The president had said, it was mentioned in the video, that we need to deculturalize the price tag on women. Now in Sierra Leone, many of the women interviewed in this segment mentioned that, particularly in rural areas in Sierra Leone, there are certain cultural practices regarding women as chattel, as like commodities. They're treated as commodities and treated like property to be sold off to the highest bidder as brides. So when they're girls, they're seen as burdens by the families, the communities, right? And so There's that, and this kind of contributes to the normalization of sexualized violence and other violence, gender-based violence against women, right? So there's also the question of gender equality under patriarchal social structures. Women need more access to opportunity and empowerment, as some of these women had explained. What we really need to do is change some of the ideas where we need to value girls as much as we value boys in society. And this, unfortunately, under patriarchal social structures, is something that we see all too often in societies, where girl children are not valued as much as boy children, right? And various different. This takes different manifestations in different contexts, right? One important thing that they talked about in these interviews was that the perpetrators in Sierra Leone are people that we trust. They are family members, intimate partners, others in the community that we know, and sometimes victims are kept silent by other members of the community that these perpetrators are committing sexualized violence. Right. So, Agatha at the Rainbow Institute talked about how we need to bring men into the conversation through men engagement programs. And another important thing that she and others talked about was how oftentimes the blame is shifted to the survivor of the assault, not the perpetrator. We see this in our country too. This is no different, right? And Agatha talked about how her own experiences with the police, with her sexual assault, right? And how she was discounted and how she ran into like basically this wall, right? And she and others said we need to shift the blame to the perpetrator so that survivors know that it is not their fault. They can come forward with their stories, get the help that they need, and get some redress, right? And the first lady of Sierra Leone, there's a video clip from her. She's leading a campaign called Hands Off Our Girls. And she actually was one of the people who persuaded her husband, the president, to do something to call it that, which he in turn called this national emergency. And it talks about in the video how he was particularly affected by one story of an infant who was a victim of a rape who died, right? And how this really affected him deeply. And they talked about it, and she, urged him to do something, which was awesome, right? So calling this a national emergency makes the issue front and center in Sierra Leone and gives it the attention it deserves to combat the incidence of sexualized violence in the country. Important to change the laws, but also change the culture, particularly on the community level, because you can change the laws or you can enforce the laws that are already on the books, but without changing the culture with regard to norms and ideas with regard to gender and the value of women and girls, nothing's going to change. And particularly, you need to engage with the boys. The local community leaders need to get involved and engage with the boys to change their attitudes, behaviors, and teach them that there is a better way to be, right? So this is a short video with regard to our materials for today. I hope that you read and enjoy them as much as we can for a topic like this. And I will see you on Thursday, April 23rd. Thank you.